In today's webinar, we'll be covering the 4 pillars of making a great mobile app: architecture, scalability, measurability, and team dynamics. With that, I wanted to introduce our speakers today, Christine and Simon. Christine?
Hi, everyone. I'm Christine. I lead product growth at Embrace. We are a mobile-only tool that helps developers monitor their apps and then get down to the nitty-gritty and debug them. Simon?
Hi, everyone. I'm Simon. I'm a software engineer of many years. I run a software agency. I previously worked at Facebook for a number of years on their front-end engineering team. I more recently worked at Google on the YouTube team, so I've done a bunch of different stuff, and now I do consulting and software development with startups.
You now have presenter.
Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, cool. So, we're going to talk to you about the 4 pillars today of building a great mobile app. And so I'm going to talk about the first 2 here, so architecture and scalability. And I think that first, let's just kind of define what we're talking about here. So I think really software architecture is about designing and building a system in a way that not just meets the project requirements, but does so in a robust way, right? So the characteristics of good architecture can depend on your needs, right? Like what particular things are important to you or to your product. But I think broadly speaking, good architecture includes correctness, right? So like if your software doesn't do what it's meant to do, if it doesn't compute the correct answer, it doesn't matter how performant it is, right? So correctness I always think of as number 1. Maintainability is important if you're going to grow. Resilience, right? Like how is it going to stand the test of time or the test of load, and then scalability and performance. And so, if we kind of like drill down into scalability in particular, right? I think that, typically people think of scalability as just, will my server fail if there's a bunch of users using it? And that is, an accurate representation of one facet of scalability. But I also think about like, will this app scale with your business, right? Like as your business needs new features, can we scale up the feature set? Does your development team scale, right? Can you go from being a 2 developer team, and I've done this on a project, to going to being, 9 or 10 or 12 developers is a big jump. And then that next jump is going up to like, 50 or things like that. So can it scale that way, right? And so, I tend to think of it as future-proof, like how future-proof is your app? That kind of dictates that. And broadly looking at these topics, I think about it this way, or the question that I'd like you to kind of ask yourself is this: what makes production software different from like a hackathon project or a hobby project, right? And so you think about it, and there's numerous reasons that production software is sort of operates at scale, that is well architected and has scalability. And I can't cover all those in this talk, but I've picked a few that I think are pretty important, at least in the context of mobile apps or front-end development. And I think about modularity. I think about UI. Like thinking globally in terms of your global reach. Debugging, theming, feature gating, and we're going to kind of dive into this kind of summary of what I'm going to talk to you about. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is build code to be thrown away. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, you're not going to throw away your entire code base, but over time you are, right? So one piece at a time. So components of your code base should be built with a lifespan in mind, that you're going to replace them eventually, right? So you think about, this is the opposite of what your modern laptop or iPhone is, right? Where you can't just replace a certain piece of it. You have to throw the whole device away. That is not what you want at software at scale, right? Production quality software, you need to be able to take a piece out and iterate and evolve your software over time. And so you need to be able to move fast, right? I mean, in this industry, you're not going to make it if you don't move fast, right? It's a high-paced game we're playing, and so that means creating things that are not perfect, right? You should be creating things that you're like, this is iteration 1, this is MVP, this is a feature that we're going to put out there to test it, and that you're going to iterate on that, and that is not the final thing. So knowing, like, building in a way that you're going to be like, okay, cool, I'm going to rip that out later, or I'm going to iterate on that and change that, allows you to kind of move forward with minimal friction. So How do you do that? Decoupled components, right? From a UI standpoint, from a mobile app, like certain flows, the auth flow is going to change at some point. The transaction history, or the my profile, or the feed. These things individually should be decoupled from the rest of the system as much as possible. And I like to even think about decoupled logic, right? In terms of, we already have that to some extent with like microservices, or with the kind of divide between server and client, so that you can swap things out on the server side, and the client is essentially decoupled from how the data is stored, or the client doesn't need to know if you're using Postgres or Mongo, because you have that nice decoupling layer. And so I'd encourage you to think about that aspect of architecture when you're building your mobile app. And on that topic, you think about UI is going to change over time. And I kind of like this slide because I remember using these old phones, with T9 and stuff. And you think about Nokia was king back then, right? Nokia had an incredible market share. They had a really incredible product, but now they're nothing, right? There's nothing left. They couldn't keep up. They couldn't really. They couldn't innovate. They couldn't move fast when it came, when the smartphone revolution came around. And so, that's a little bit of a side note, because UI is one piece of that, as well as business aspects to it. But ultimately, think about it this way: the design refreshes are going to happen. They're going to happen often. If you use well thought out UI theming patterns, that'll make this less painful, right? Think about when dark mode came out last year, and all these companies scrambling to try to figure out how am I going to get my UI to be rethemed into dark mode. The companies that made good, mobile app architecture decisions early on, good theming patterns, use the right theming libraries, are probably coming out winning, right? And so, at minimum, if you don't take anything else away from the UI theming piece, is that just have your developers put your colors, your font sizes, your font families, put things like that into a theme file, and put it in a place where you can tweak it and adjust it and change it. Now, the other piece of that is that not only is your UI going to change over time, but your entire app is going to be evolving. And when you're writing small stuff, when you're writing side projects and hackathons and stuff, you don't really have to think about what's going to be the state of this in 2 years. But when you're building production scale stuff, you need to think about what's going to happen. And so here's a perfect example of an app. If you haven't updated this app in a year and a half, or maybe even 6 months, you're going to see a screen that's like, hey, look, this version is no longer supported. You need to update it. And so the takeaway from this is, be aware that there will be many versions out there in the wild. There is no way that you can it's not the web. Like, mobile apps is not the web where every time they visit your website, they're going to get the latest version of the page. This is a process that not all users follow, which is going to the app store and doing the updates. Some people have automatic updates, some people don't. And so just be aware, these are things you have to think about at scale. You don't want to be stuck supporting a legacy client app version forever. You want to be able to move quickly with your backend. You want to be able to deprecate things. And so I think the correct approach there is to make a clean, well-defined UI that just tells users, so if it receives some signal from the server, if the server says minimum supported version is 2.1 and they've got 1.8, that this thing will pop up and display it. And this is something you have to think about at the beginning, because if you don't put that screen in the app, if you don't think about versioning and deprecation early on, you can't add that later, because those apps are already out there. They're already on people's phones, right? Now, when we think about versions that are out there in the wild, another thing is like what does the landscape look like? How do we think globally? And so obviously there's internationalization, and there's languages and stuff. One thing that I think people don't always think about is not everybody has the device that you and me are using, right? We're probably on something relatively recent. You look at even the US market is something like 50, 60% iPhone. That is not representative of the world, right? Only about 4% of people live in the US. If you're a small town bank in Idaho, you probably don't have to think global. You don't have to think about internationalization. You don't have to think about what devices are common in Asia Pacific or Europe. But if you're competing on the world stage, if you're building software at scale, you do need to think about these things. And it's not just like the device landscape. It's also latency, intermittent connectivity. Thinking about different time zones, thinking about date formats, right? Metric system is a common one that people overlook. Currencies, languages, an interesting thing when I think about displaying different content for different regions, right? So it's common for you to talk, you've got this cool app on the home screen, you roll out something that talks about the Super Bowl coming up, right? Maybe that doesn't mean anything to somebody in Bolivia or somebody in Thailand, right? Or, you say, hey, what are the hot summer fashions? And it's right in your homepage, a feature thing about the new summer, trends or whatever. And then, you don't really think, well, it's not summer everywhere, right? It's not summer in Sydney or Melbourne or South Africa. So, thinking just ahead about what is the content I want to show in my app to different regions? Do I want to be able to feature gate this? Do I want to be able to say, okay, this region sees this thing and this other region sees another thing? And part of that is making your app, like if you want to scale, making your app sticky, making it interesting for different people. But these are all not the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room when it comes to thinking globally is internationalization, right? I-18N. And this is pretty standard thing. We've been doing this for many years. The software industry understands this. But if you take nothing else away from this, I want you to know it is way easier to think about this from the start than to try to slip this in later. It is incredibly hard to sort of tack on internationalization once you realize that, oh shoot, we're expanding into Europe, or maybe even we're expanding north of the border to Canada, and we need to support French, right? So I would say this, like this is what I do with my team. I don't want to add a ton of friction to my developers, but early on, I always say at the minimum, just wrap your user-facing static strings, right? I'm not gonna, obviously we can't do anything about user-generated content, but the content that we write, the text, the labels, the buttons, the stuff that the static strings that are written in the source code, wrap those in an internet, like in our tech framework, we use a little T function for translate. I don't have to translate them today. I just want to wrap them in a way so that can be done in the future. And then, dates and numbers, right? So always store and transmit your dates in, ISO standard formats, and then, wrap your dates and your numbers in the right function call, so you just display it in the right format for that locale. I don't want to go down this path too far because I know this could be a whole entire tech talk, but if you really want to dive in, you can start thinking about, how do I know which language to send out a push notification, or or what do I do for languages that are left to right layouts, right? RTL layouts, right to left. So you think about Hebrew and Arabic and things. So that's the hardcore internationalization stuff. But if you take nothing else away, take the 3 points about strings, dates, and numbers. Featured gating. And so this is an interesting topic that I never really thought about before joining Facebook. And so we had a really powerful system internally at Facebook for turning features on and off for users, right? And the reason why we do that, the analogy is like changing the engine of the plane while the aircraft is in flight, right? And I think that'll make more sense as I try to explain this. So the idea is this. So imagine you want to build a feature that's a UI refreshing your app, and it's going to take many iterations. You could say, all right, well, I can't just stop development on my main normal UI and go off and do a refresh. I can't just land the plane, take the app down, do my work, and then put the app back up again. Can't do that either. Now, what I could do is kind of fork it and have this team over here that's kind of working on the new look and feel and this new awesome feature, and then everybody else is kind of going down the normal path of keeping it running. But then I have this feature where I have to merge the two back in together, and that's going to be a problem as well. And then also the fact that do I then test it all in the sandbox environment and then merge it later, but then I haven't really tested it in prod. And so the correct answer to this, like what the big tech companies, what the pros do with this, is that we build in a system to flag or gate features on or off for different users. So you basically are building on the main production build the whole time, but your users aren't seeing it. It's behind a gate. You just turn it off. Now the advantage to this is that not only do you not have to worry about the complexity of merging this fork or this branch in, but you also get the ability to have certain users tested, right? So you're like, hey, I'm going to roll this out to 5%. I'm going to roll this out to this region only. At Facebook, we often roll things out to New Zealand only because they were kind of English speaking but far away and a small population, and we kind of guinea pig with that a little bit. But it was very common to roll things out 1%, 5%, 10%, and then you have a holdout, so you roll it out 95%. You can kind of see, okay, these people are using the new feature, these people aren't. So can we see, engagement going up or down, things like that. So feature gating is, again, a big topic. I can't cover it completely in here, but I think it's something to think about when you're thinking about software at scale. And then you've got, error handling, debugging, right? It's really easy to debug when you're in the simulator, when you're locally, when you're in development. What happens when things go wrong in production, right? And so there's a few things you can do, that you can think about in terms of architecting your app so that debugging in the wild is going to be less painful. So obviously, table stakes here, error logging and reporting. I assume you're already doing that. One of the things is make sure that you are collecting the right information, right? So when you make an error log, like let's make sure we have the app version. That's probably a no-brainer. What about the locale? What about basic device info? What about I need to know if they're on an iPhone 5C. I need to know what operating system version they're on. And then the other thing is like make sure you're not just collecting crash reports. Crash reports are great, but I need to know when things unexpected, when the user gets into kind of a weird state, when they're somehow in this stuck situation and the server requests aren't working. Like log as much as you can to help you kind of debug those things. And then also, think about your kind of signal to noise ratio in terms of the notifications that your developers or your sort of DevOps team or whoever's responding to these things, make sure that they're not getting bombarded. Because I remember, it's very easy. You're getting so much information coming in that you can't even filter out what's relevant. Like what is an actual spike in 404 errors being returned from the server, or 500 errors that the client doesn't know how to handle? Like is that an actual spike or is it lost in the noise, right? And then, maybe one interesting thing that you don't always think about is that users will do stuff you really don't expect. And so my sort of favorite example of that is, so when I was at YouTube, we had bug reports that were coming in or error reporting that was coming in that was absolutely not reproducible. It was only happening on Android. It was a very small percentage, but extremely steady percentage of devices that were getting these errors that we couldn't even track down to like a place in code. Like it didn't even match up with like a spot in code where things are going wrong. Line numbers weren't even there. Like we didn't have enough information. We couldn't figure it out. Turns out, so on Android, you can side load apps. You can install apps that don't come from the Play Store. And so what happens is that there are people who take, the YouTube app and the Spotify app and other apps, and they kind of decompile it and they mess with the code and they add things to remove the ads, to add premium features that you would normally have to pay for. And they kind of manipulate and inject things in, and then they distribute these APKs around in the kind of dark corners of the internet, and users install these things. But what they don't do, obviously, because these guys are hacking together some really dirty stuff, and they're not writing clean code, that's for sure. And so they're not taking out the error reporting. The error reporting is still there, and we're getting errors that don't even make any sense because it's code that we didn't write. It's code that's been manipulated. And it took an enormous amount of effort and time to kind of diagnose what was happening there. Like, why are we getting these bug reports, and then eventually to filter it out. And so these are stories that you kind of learn working at scale that you're like, wow, you don't think about that somebody's going to modify my app out there. So anyway, if you take this away from it, that debugging is really hard, and in the wild it's even harder. And so expect the unexpected, if that makes any sense. Users will do things, things will go wrong. And then maybe lastly, like add a place where users can just submit some feedback. It's way easier to just ask the user, get in contact with them, figure out what they were trying to do, than just try to filter through automated log files. Automated testing, I probably don't have to, I assume that everybody who's been building software understands that software engineers need to write tests, and so I won't harp on a lot about that, but I will say this. You have, especially on the business side, you have limited resources, and you want to maximize those resources in terms of developer, time and energy and effort. And so, how do we invest our testing effort where we get the most return? And so if you've seen this kind of classic testing pyramid, you've got your unit tests, which is your baseline. You do the most of those, do a few fewer integration tests, and you do the fewest or a little bit of investment in end-to-end testing. What I mean by that specifically is that unit tests are basically easy. That's your baseline, it's your bottom of the pyramid. They're easy for developers to write. They're fairly robust. They're not going to break easily. They're tightly coupled to the code though, but they're easy wins. So you invest, you do the most of those, right? Write a healthy amount of integration tests, particularly focus on regressions, right? So when things go wrong that you didn't previously expect, you fixed it. Let's make sure it doesn't break again. Like make sure it stays fixed. So you write an integration test for that, right? Integration tests are things that incorporate multiple aspects of your code. And then you get your end-to-end test, which is like when you fire up the app in an actual simulator in a server farm somewhere, and then it like simulates clicks through the entire flow. It usually does this against a production database with maybe a test login or against a simulated database. These things are really hard to get right. They're very flaky and finicky because like as you change the user flow, you have to rewrite these things. And then when you layer on visual snapshot tests, which is like, okay, go through this particular flow, snapshot the screen, see how many pixels have changed since the last time, and if things are really wonky, then notify somebody. These are powerful tools, but they're incredibly resource intensive. So, definitely focus your effort where you get the most value out of there. automation in terms of deployment, especially deployment, right? Automate as much as possible. Don't have a single point of failure, right? You never want to make the mistake of having one individual who knows how to, launch this app to the App Store, knows how to build this or compile this tool or the software. Kind of interesting story there is that when I was consulting for this telecom in Southeast Asia, and we were gonna go through this kind of refresh of their mobile app, this kind of reimagination or rewrite of it, and we're like, okay, what's your existing app? How is it built? How do you get onto the Play Store? And they're like, okay, cool. What we have is we have this laptop. It's in this room. Nobody touches it. It's the only laptop that knows how to build this. The guy who set it up no longer works here. You go in there with your little USB stick. You load the source code. You press a button, and then just like it does this work, and then like out pops this APK or this IPA or whatever. You send it up to the app. We're like, oh my goodness. You can't do this. Like, you can't have your business like depend on this laptop. Like, what happens if the hard drive crashes or gets a virus? We have backups. And I was like, no, I get that, but like reproducible automated things, like we have the cloud for this. Like, this should be a script that is written that happens in a build pipeline and things. And so that's probably an extreme example, although probably more companies than you realize have the magic laptop in the corner in the back room, or maybe it's a magic server or whatever. So these are things that are fragile, and automation can solve it. Like, if you have a policy of automation at your company from day one, where it's like, like every amount of knowledge to do a given task must be automated in a way that is reproducible in the cloud, then you will never run into this. So, reduce the cognitive load on your developers, right? And so that's in terms of automate as much of code stylistic things, linting, formatting. Like, don't make your developers think about where to insert semicolons, or if the code formatting is at the right style. Like, automate as much of that as possible so you can move quickly. Okay, so I'm almost done. Hopefully I haven't used up all my time. Just some secret sauce, some things that kind of I do that kind of try to give my development team some superpowers. Generally falls under the category of work smarter, not harder, right? Which I'm sure you already know, but how to do that, right? So the key to lean high velocity development really is trying to do more with fewer developers. How do I do that? There's probably lots of ways to do this. One of the things is, let's not build for iOS and then separately build for Android and then separately build for web if we can share some of that burden, share some of that code. And it's been something that's sort of give or take been possible for a long time with HTML5 and this and that. But like in modern days, doing that in a way without killing quality and performance, right? We have these tools. We have React Native, Expo is a set of tooling on React Native. We have Flutter. These are really powerful, really modern, amazing things that allow me, so React Native is my poison of choice. And I'm able to, with a single team, with a single code base, build out a high quality, high performant app for iOS, do it for Android, and more recently, even for web with a single code base. And, this stuff keeps getting better, right? Native Windows and Mac. Native Windows is already out. It's been backed by Microsoft. Native Mac desktop apps built with React Native with the same code base that you're building other, web and mobile with. It's sort of impossible with Electron, but like in a React Native, like a properly native way, this is really, really exciting stuff. So that's a little bit of kind of how I achieve high velocity development at scale with as few developers as possible. And that's what I have for you. So thanks. I'm gonna kind of hand this over to Christine.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, so are you guys able to see my screen? Perfect. So I'm going to talk about the last two pillars, measurability and teams. I've worked with a lot of teams during my time at Embrace, small and large. One of the big things that I emphasize is measuring what you're doing. So measurement is important for an app, because if you have no idea where you stand, you have no idea whether there is room for improvement or things are getting worse. And with mobile, it's especially important because there are so many different variables. It's different from web in that every single device is its own environment. And so to predict every single thing that could go wrong is very difficult. And so if you can measure things at an extremely high level, and take a look at trends, it can identify things that are going wrong in your app much more easily rather than trying to mentally think about every single possible thing that can go wrong. And so when it comes to measurement, I think of it in 3 different ways. You want to measure stability. Is your app working the way that it's supposed to? It means your app isn't crashing, you don't have frozen screens, you're not using too much CPU, there aren't memory leaks, and it's not causing extreme battery drainage. The second is performance. How fast is your app? I think stability at this point in time is kind of table stakes. A lot of times you have apps that are competing with one another, and to the consumer, sometimes the feature set is pretty much the same. And what will beat out the other app is which one is faster, which one has the faster startup, which one can I start shopping with more, which one can I request food delivery faster from. And so performance is very important. And then the last one is just the impact, whether it's engagement or revenue. And what's important about that is once you figure out the impact, it helps you prioritize what you want to focus on with your app and whether or not it's important to you and your user base. Maybe you are experiencing a lot of crashes on an extremely old phone or an extremely old operating system. And then you have to take a look at it and see, how big is this in terms of my user base? Is this in a growing market that I am potentially trying to penetrate? And so these are things that when you're measuring are very important to understand. So I'll delve into each of those 3 points. So stability, most people start off with the crash-free rate, crash-free users. It's a great metric, but stability in mobile goes beyond crashes because your mobile app is not only interacting with other SDKs that you've put in your app, but it's also operating within an operating system. And with Apple, for example, there are rules that are in place for best practices, and the operating system may kill your app if you are not following these best practices. So for example, if you are using too much memory and the operating system doesn't like it, it can kill your app. Will it produce a crash report? Probably not. And in those cases, it's not just an exception. It's not just bad code. It's, a slow memory leak that is not producing an optimal app. And so in those cases, I like to tell people stability goes beyond crashes, especially with mobile because there are so many interactions and you're operating within an operating system. And so if you have tooling that doesn't measure what percentage of sessions end in or what percentage of sessions end in user termination when the user force quits the app, or what percentage of sessions end in an ANR exit where the app is not responsive, then you can take a look at some higher level metrics to help guide you and tell you where your app is going. So one of the big metrics that I like to look into is the percentage of sessions with the cold start. So typically if your app goes into the background and the user opens it up again, you'll get a warm start. But if your app is using too much memory or CPU or is hanging the main thread, the operating system will kill it if it goes into the background. So if you have a high rate of cold starts, it may be indicative of the operating system killing your app in the background. You will also get a cold start when a user terminates the app. And there are some people that will force quit an app just out of habit, but you do want to look into whether or not that percentage increases. So if I see a frozen screen on my app, typically what I'll do is force quit. And so that will also trigger a cold startup. So if you're tracking the percentage of sessions with a cold start release over release, you can start to tell whether or not there's something going wrong with your app. Two other things to track in terms of stability, memory leaks. So the operating system will tell you if you have a low memory warning. And so if you keep track of that version over version and you start to see an increase in low memory warnings, it may be indicative of memory leaks with your app. And then the last one is battery drainage. That produces a very poor experience for the user. And so how I like to evaluate that is taking a look at the percentage of sessions where the user is in low power mode and making sure that that measurement stays the same release over release. If it happens to increase in one particular release, maybe you've introduced a feature that is draining battery. The next thing is performance. Like I mentioned before, stability tends to be table stakes. Really, when you are comparing apps, you want to make sure that your app is extremely performant. I like to monitor key parts of the app. For all apps, one of those is startup. For an e-commerce app, it's add to cart, checkout, purchase. For maybe a social media app, that might be uploading photos. And so I like to tell our users to track those successes and failures in the key parts of the app and have those be KPIs. So you want to track these levels over time. And if there are any unexpected deviations, you want to make sure you can explain them. For example, if you see a sudden spike in logins, it might be that your app is logging people out. And so these are things that you can keep track of in terms of understanding, is my app working normally? And these are very important parts of my app that I want to make sure that we maintain just the highest performance within these parts. Then when you want to get into timing, you want to make sure that everything is happening quickly. Performance is starting to become more and more of a differentiator. So I will often ask people, how long does your startup take? Do you know how long your startup takes? And do you know how long your competitor's startup takes? It's a really important question. And I think a lot of people will assume that, when they're testing their devices in a place with great Wi-Fi on the newest iPhone, that is exemplary. That exemplifies what their users are experiencing. But if you are working in international markets, that might not be the case. Your startup may work really well on the newest iPhone, but your startup may work terribly on a Redmi device or something, it may be very slow in India, and that's a market you're entering into. And so what you want to do is you want to take into account, okay, here is maybe my ideal situation, but where are my customers at? And how long does it take for them to go through this experience? I think that there are a lot of places where, you can improve on startup. And by measuring it first, you're able to establish a baseline and then take a look and see where there are possible improvements. I've worked with customers where it made sense for them to have blocking network calls at one point in time, maybe related to a third-party SDK or their own APIs. But later on, as they have gotten more of a market share and it becomes more competitive, it becomes more important that you are reevaluating that and making sure that you are making it as fast as possible. The other thing that I tell mobile developers, it's taking a look at your first-party API calls. It's a part of the mobile experience to the user, but not entirely the burden of the mobile team to fix sometimes. I worked with one dating app where they kind of knew one of their endpoints was slow. And they've always had an inkling. But when we actually started to take a look at it and we showed them how slow it actually was, that it was taking 5 to 6 seconds, they told me, they're like, wow, we never realized it was actually that slow. And so it's important to take a look at your first party API calls, make sure that they are fast and that they aren't degrading over time. And then the last thing to tie this all together is the impact. You want to understand how all of these things impact your app. It'll help you prioritize issues, and it'll help you see if you make improvements to the performance or you make improvements to the stability, what does that mean? And so impact is different for different types of apps. For certain apps like social media apps, it's taking a look at engagement, looking at median session duration, or the total time a user spends in the app per day. With e-commerce apps, it's a little bit simpler. You can measure just revenue. And if you want to take a look at specific things that may go wrong in your funnel, you may want to understand what is your cart value at checkout. And if it never goes from checkout to purchase, how much are you losing? So these are kind of these high level metrics that you can monitor on your app, release over release, to monitor the health. As you grow, you essentially end up slicing and dicing these metrics by region. For example, you have where you primarily operate, or if you want to go into a new region, you'll slice and dice by that. So that you can see, if I am entering into India, I want the performance in India to match that of the US. You may also cut it by personas. You may see, okay, I have these extremely high value users. I want to understand what their experience is like versus regular users. Or you may want to measure new user experience. What does that startup look like? Do they have to download a bunch of files? Maybe that is contributing to more people dropping off at the very beginning. So you can take these base level metrics to give you an indication of the health of your app without going too much into detail as to what is exactly breaking it. I think it gives you a good directional indicator, because I think with mobile, one of the most difficult things is understanding like all of the different environments. And so if you take these measurements at extremely high level, you can kind of narrow it down from there and see where you should look. So monitoring stability and KPIs is becoming increasingly important. Going into teams, I've watched mobile teams grow a lot in the past 2 years. I've worked with a lot of companies where they are mobile first, mobile only, and when we first met with them, they only had 1 or 2 developers. They were able to run very lean, but I think over the past 2 years, mobile teams have been growing because they have been a bigger part of the revenue. I've started to see some e-commerce companies go beyond 50% revenue from their mobile app. The engagement is more on their mobile app, and people are pushing their users towards the mobile app. And so I've watched teams grow from 1 to 2 developers to 15 plus. And it's definitely a struggle. And it's definitely something that I've watched them do and seen how they've morphed into it and how they've made the best of it. So originally, a lot of these teams are tiny and focused on feature development. They are only dealing with bugs when they are a really big deal. And other than that, they are fully focused on feature development. Once a team starts growing and you have a lead, you start to have more people contributing to the code. You won't know everything that is happening, all of the changes that are being made. And so in these cases, as the team grows and they start to have maybe 2 or 3 developers report to a team lead, the structure changes in that the team lead starts focusing on the release. They will monitor those metrics that I talked about at the release level because they want to be able to tie an issue to a release and fix an issue as close to release as possible, because teams will cycle through developers, and if it's lost, if it's not addressed right away, sometimes it gets lost and it just gets more into the mix of the code and it gets more and more difficult to find. And then as I've seen teams grow from that into very large teams where you have several feature teams, it's kind of a hub and spoke type structure. You have several feature teams with one mobile platform team that oversees all of it. Monitoring stability and KPIs have become extremely integral because you have so many people contributing to the code, and all of these things and these interactions, you cannot possibly communicate all of them. And so as these teams grow, it becomes more and more important to monitor and measure these things so that there is some indication that you can, or there's some guardrails that will indicate if something goes wrong. And with these teams, the faster a team is able to identify an issue and then point to the person to fix it, the more successful that mobile team is. It doesn't end up getting plagued by the same issues over and over and over again. Definitely as teams have grown from 2 developers to 12 to 15 to 50, the biggest thing is truly monitoring. And as they are increasing their revenue for particular companies, where I've seen a lot of stress come from mobile teams is that they cannot tie these things to revenue, or they can't tie these things to impact. And it makes things very difficult because mobile developers tend to code to perfection, because once you make a release, it's out there. Someone may be on that one release that is 2 or 3 years old because they never update. Like Simon mentioned, it's not like web. It's not like web where you fix something and that the greatest and latest thing is pushed to everyone. And so with mobile teams, you do have this thing where you are trying to code to perfection. But when the team grows and you have so many features that you need to build, it's difficult to identify something and say, okay, this is the thing that's broken, but does it affect a population or a user base that I care about? And where does this fall in the priority list? And I've seen teams as they grow struggle with that. But the teams that are monitoring and have an idea of what their user base looks like, and they slice and dice these issues and by user impact, understanding the operating system that the user is on, understanding the region that it affects, or understanding the personas. Is this affecting new users? Is it affecting your power users? These are all things that make it easier for the team to function well. They're able to focus on features and then and address the issues that actually matter and that affect the bottom line. So yeah, I mean, that's what I have for measurement and teams. Anton?
Yes, thank you, Christine. Let me go ahead and take this screen from you. All right, so we have quite a few questions coming in, I think about 10. But before we get into questions, I wanted to kind of quickly share how you can stay connected with us. So here's on the screen. I'll also share this PowerPoint presentation later today as well. And then, while I have you here, I want to quickly share with you, our platform. Go ahead and feel free to try it. You can go ahead and go to hug.army/free, and that'll take you to our registration page.